Okay, good morning everyone to the second day of the ICMC. This session is everything entropy, N20, in case you're trying to follow along in your programs and mark yourselves as here. Our first presentation in this session is a practical guide to entropy by Lisa Rabe from Cisco, and I will let her do her thing.
Good morning. So I'm Lisa Rabe from Cisco. I work for the Global Certifications team at Cisco, and I also started the Entropy Working Group 6 years ago and have run it ever since. And I've learned a lot about entropy through this Entropy Working Group, and I decided it might be helpful to give some practical advice for people that are trying to figure this entropy stuff out. So this is not going to be a terribly technical talk. Instead, this is for vendors who have a product that they want to get certified, and they need help figuring out what they're going to do with entropy. There's another talk right after mine with just about the same topic, but we compared notes, and they're not duplicates. Oops. Oh, I'm missing a slide. I have an agenda slide, and I don't know where it went. Oh, here it is. So we're going to talk real quickly about what is entropy and a brief overview of the ESV certification process. Then we're going to dive into different types of entropy sources, physical and non-physical. And again, our goal here is to give practical information for people that want to implement entropy sources. We're going to talk about what options are out there. And then finally, we're going to talk about what you can do if you need help. Oh, is that not? Okay. So entropy, in terms of cryptography, entropy is randomness. We use entropy to seed the DRBGs to generate the keys that protect our data. In a nutshell, that's what it is. You hear a lot of people saying, why is there so much attention to give to this? Why is it so picky? Does it really matter? There's lots of ways to get decent entropy that are a lot easier than meeting all the requirements in 90B. Why does it really matter? Well, it does really matter. Cryptography is only as strong as its keys, and the keys are only as strong as the entropy that's used to create them. If you don't have good entropy to create your keys, and your keys can be broken, your cryptography is worthless. So it really is important. There are a couple recent developments in the entropy community. NIAP, starting January 1st, is going to require ESV certs for all products going through CC certifications, again, under NIAP. And also the latest and hopefully last draft of 90C that's going to be available for public comment was released a couple months ago, excuse me, and they are still accepting comments until September 30th. All right, just a real quick overview. The ESV is Entropy Source Validation. It's a program that was developed to give an independent certification for entropy sources. It is a standalone certificate that you need to get alongside a FIPS 140-3 or coming up alongside a CC. It can be reused, and you can designate, you want this to be bound to the vendor where your vendor can use it in your products, or do you want to make it open for public use? And companies like Intel and AMD are more likely to pick the open for public use. There's a lot that goes into getting an ESV cert. I'm not going to stand here and read all these, and that's really not the point of this slide. The point of the slide is to say there's a lot involved. You have to really understand every detail of how the entropy source works and where it gets its initial randomness. You have to, really the most important part, according to the CMVP, is the theoretical estimate of how much your entropy source should produce. So you don't just run the tests and say, here's how much entropy I produce. You have to give a statistical heuristic argument about why it should produce a certain amount. You have to produce millions of samples of raw data to run through the NIST statistical tests, and you have to include a shall statement that addresses each of the 130-some shall statements in 90B and the FIPS IG, and tell where every single one of those requirements was met in your report. So an ESV cert it's a big effort. All right, so there are two types of entropy sources, and this is as NIST defined them. There are different ways, different organizations define entropy sources different ways, but NIST has chosen to divide them up into physical and non-physical. So a physical entropy source is something that has hardware that does nothing but generate entropy. And it shouldn't say the hardware generates the entropy. The hardware gathers entropy from natural phenomenon in the world that are random, or that at least we don't understand well enough to be able to predict. So a physical entropy source could get its initial entropy from thermal noise or background radiation. It could get it from patterns of raindrops. We don't know how to predict those exactly, or ocean waves, or wind currents, even lava lamps are theoretically a good source of entropy. So a physical entropy source has hardware that somehow channels one of those entropy sources and changes it into random bits that you can use to seed your DRBG. A non-physical entropy source, on the other hand, it looks for entropy on your system, on your device, on your computer. It looks for entropy that's already there that it can use to seed your DRBG. Physical noise sources are often, the ones that you see a lot are ring oscillators, noisy diodes, metastable latches. Non-physical entropy sources, on the other hand, are things that gather their entropy from interrupt timings and disk-seek timings and mouse and keyboard movements if you have them. The important thing to know is that both of them can be used in a 90B entropy source, and both have to comply with all of the 90B requirements. So let's dig a little more into physical entropy sources. Most people, when you say physical entropy source, they think, oh, the RNG on my processor. Read RAND and read seed is the most widely known. Their first question is, well, I've got a great entropy source, can I continue to use it? And the answer to that is maybe. Sometimes you can, sometimes you can't. Whoops. There are two paths to using a hardware entropy source to getting an ESV cert. One is if the manufacturer of the CPU gets the cert for you, and that's certainly the preferred route for most people. Intel has got entropy certs on some of their chips. AMD, there are a lot of them. And if they get one and it's open to public use, you can just point to it. It's also possible to get your own cert on a CPU manufacturer's entropy source. But in either case, it requires the absolute complete cooperation of the manufacturer. This information that NIST needs is very detailed and very specific, and you need entropy data that's not available to the user. So basically, if you don't have the absolute complete cooperation of the manufacturer, then you don't have a path to using a physical entropy source, the entropy source on your chip in an ESV cert. In the entropy working group, we have a lot of CPU manufacturers, and some of them gave me statements that they asked me to share. And this is just meant, this is not a commercial, I didn't get kickbacks, but they just wanted, I'm trying to provide practical information. So I had 5 or 6 vendors that said, can you make this statement? So I'm going to break all the rules and just read these so that people can see exactly what these vendors are doing. AMD has said many of the AMD processor families contain an integrated RNG that already has an ESV cert, and they gave a point of contact if you want to talk to them about it. Broadcom has developed TRNG IPs, which are implemented in silicon in different ASIC processes. Our customers develop custom ASIC chips and use our IP in them. We've received ESV certs for the TRNG in each silicon process it's implemented in. Since the entropy content differs by process, we've pursued ESV certs for each process. The anticipated use is that our customers can cite these certs when they want to get FIPS 140-3 certs on their ASICs. So again, Broadcom already has certs for a lot of theirs, and the vendors can use them, and they give a point of contact. Intel said, we are committed to supporting our customers and partners for details on entropy validation support for specific products, and they give a point of contact. And Intel has been very, very active in the entropy working group and working with the community for a long time, and they really try to support their customers and get certs on as many of the processors as they can. At Microchip, we have numerous products from complex secure processors to low-cost root of trust processor companion devices that contain RFGs that are 90B compliant. We currently offer production devices that already have a cert. They have other devices that are in the pipeline to get their certs, and they're developing sources that will be targeted for certification. They said they have current noise source implementations, include ring oscillator-based entropy sources and thermal noise induced jitter sources. And if you have any questions, there's a point of contact for Microchip. The last one I have is NXP. If your product contains an NXP processor and you want to know whether it has a cert, the first thing to do is just check the ESV cert listing. They have several certs in place already and more are in progress. They said if an ESV cert has not already been achieved on a specific part that you need, we're generally happy to go through the ESV process on behalf of our customers. And so if you have questions, contact Mark Ireland. So that is some information that I just hope might be handy to to vendors who were hoping to use the entropy source, the RNG that's on their processor. But in summary, using a physical entropy source requires the complete cooperation of the manufacturer. What if you don't have that? The other type of entropy source is a non-physical entropy source. There are a lot of reasons that people use non-physical entropy sources. You know, we just talked about physical entropy sources and about what it takes to get a cert on them, and there are a lot of people that aren't in the position to do that. So if you have a product maybe that doesn't have access to a physical entropy source, then you want to look at non-physical entropy sources. If you have access to a physical entropy source, but it can't be validated or it hasn't been validated and it isn't going to be validated, you can't use it. So a non-physical entropy source is an option for you. And another common scenario is if you have a product that can be run on a lot of different platforms, it might not be practical to get ESV certs on each one of those. You know, they might span across different processors, different brands. That could be a big effort. In those cases, sometimes using a single non-physical entropy source that then all you have to do for each platform is provide the test data to show that it works, you know, as you've described. That can be a good choice, and a lot of vendors go that way. All right, let's get this one out of the way because this is always a big question. Why can't I just use DevRandom? DevRandom's great, been using it forever. Can I still use it? And the answer to that is usually no. Let's talk about why. This is an argument of whether DevRandom is good entropy or not. This is it certifiable? So if you've got just a mainstream, out-of-the-box Linux distribution, it's not going to be compliant with 90B. One problem is that 90B says you have to have a single primary source of your noise, and if that source shuts down or stops working correctly, your device has to say, I can't produce any more entropy. And the Linux PRNG doesn't work that way. There are none of the required health tests being done on the Linux PRNG. It uses multiple noise sources. It combines them in ways that are not in compliance with 90B. It uses multiple non-vetted conditioning functions, which are very difficult to certify. You have to produce a lot more test data. Getting data out of the kernel is a lot of work. And overall, you know, the one thing you can say about the Linux PRNG is that there is no one way to describe the Linux PRNG. It has so many variations, not just between kernel versions, but between the different distributions have different versions. There are so many differences that the only blanket statement that you can really make about just plain mainstream Linux distributions is that none of them are compliant with 90B. That said, there are a couple of options. SUSE, Canonical, and Red Hat have all produced versions of their operating systems that have ESV certs, so there are a couple options. Also, Stefan Mueller has developed a Linux RNG patch, the LRNG patch, that you can apply to your kernel to make the Linux PRNG compliant with 90B. So there are a couple of entropy sources that if you still really want to use your Linux PRNG, there are ways to do that. All right, so let's talk about what everybody is always thinking when you say non-physical entropy source, and people think, oh, that's a software source, and their mind thinks, well, that can never be as good. Everyone knows physical entropy sources are better. Our customers don't trust non-physical sources, or realistically, our engineers don't trust them. The customers don't usually care. What can you say? you know, how can you think this through and decide that this is still an acceptable choice for your device? Well, one thing to keep in mind is that non-physical sources still have to meet exactly the same requirements as the physical sources. There's not a single sentence in 90B that says if you have a physical source, you do this, and if you have a non-physical source, you do that. They have to meet the same requirements. They have to pass the same statistical tests, so they undergo a very rigorous examination. The other thing that's really, really important to thoroughly understand is that 90B allows you to mix in additional entropy. This is a really, really important statement. It's just a tiny little section of 90B, so I wanted to emphasize it and kind of go into a little more detail. So this is a good way to visualize how an entropy source works. You've got a gallon of white paint with red drops mixed in, and those red drops are entropy. And that entropy is coming from your primary entropy source. And you've done all the math and all the analysis, and you've figured out that if the output of your conditioning function, which is your final output from your entropy source, as long as it has 100 drops of red paint, you're compliant with 90B. Great, you're now in good shape. Well, NIST has said, okay, that's great. Let's picture the exact same scenario. You have the exact same red drops of paint entropy source. Sorry. But what if you also have a source of entropy that gives you blue dots, like redrand or devrandom or whatever, another entropy source, maybe a really good one. You know, it feels wrong to not be using it in some way. So NIST said, sure, you can use it. You can combine it with the good entropy. You have to put it through a vetted conditioning function. And you just assume that it's not adding any entropy. So it doesn't help you get your primary source certified. Your primary source that produces the red paint still you have to prove that it gives you enough entropy. But you can add in as much of those drops of blue paint as you want. So you're pumping in a lot of, you know, potentially really good entropy. And that increases the security of your system. So it doesn't help you get certified, but it absolutely helps with the security. So if you're in the position of, well, I have to use a non-physical source because, you know, I don't have access or I don't have a certifiable physical source, but I do have one, this is how you bring it in. You mix in that entropy and you get that added security. So again, this is a practical talk. So if you need to use a non-physical entropy source, what are your options? And realistically, right now, there is exactly one thing that's on the table for discussion. And this is not because it's the only one that's available. I mean, NIST, if you make up an entropy source and make it totally compliant and prove that it theoretically produces enough entropy and that your test data shows it, you can try to put it through certifications. But most of the vendors that I'm talking to right now, that's not the approach they want to take. They say, I just want something that works. CPU jitter is the thing that's seen by far the most often. The CPU jitter, again, was developed by Stefan Mueller, who's very active in this community. It's an open source entropy source, free to use. Anybody can use it. It's a small program written in C. It runs on anything, and it's been tested on lots and lots of different devices. It works really well on a lot of different platforms. It's designed to be compliant with 90B. That's an important point, because if you have an entropy source that's not designed to be compliant with 90B, there's not a chance you're going to get it through. There's no such thing as being compliant with 90B by accident. Stefan Mueller has worked very closely with the Entropy Working Group and with the CMVP to modify it and tweak it so that to make it just a little bit better. Stefan, could you do this? Could you do that? This will make it a little easier to certify. This will make it a little more configurable. And so he's worked really closely with the whole community to come up with an entropy source that really is appropriate for certification. And another good point of it is it can run in the kernel or in user space. If you're using crypto in your kernel, that's a really good point, because you need crypto coming from the kernel. So CPU jitter, at its most simple, it's a very simple premise that if you have a small set of instructions written in C in this case, and you execute them repeatedly, it's going to take a slightly different amount of time each time you execute it, because of differences in system loads and memory caches and a zillion things that make the runtime for these instructions vary from run to run. So you run it repeatedly, you collect the times that it takes, and you calculate the deltas between every two consecutive runs. And if you look at those deltas, way down in the least significant bits, there is a fair amount of entropy. So that's where CPU jitter gets its entropy. So can it really be used in a FIPS validation? Well, yes, about a third of the ESV certs that have been issued are based on CPU jitter, and that is just based on my looking through them at the names. There could be more that the name doesn't make it obvious, but a huge number of vendors have gotten certs on their ESV implementations. You know, one thing to keep in mind, just because CPU jitter is certified, that doesn't mean that a vendor can just say, hey, I'm using CPU jitter, we're good, right? Every vendor still has to get their own cert on it. CPU jitter is very dependent on the operating environment, so every vendor has to say, this is my implementation of CPU jitter, and I'm gonna show you that it's compliant with 90B. And the process to doing that is, again, it's not an inconsiderable task. You have to write the entropy analysis report and the public use document. There's a lot of good documentation out there, but picking out what the CMVP wants and making sure that you answer every single one of those shall statements is still a considerable task. You also have to give a really good heuristic description of, you know, how much entropy this thing should be producing so that you can give that theoretical estimate. And that, you know, you need to know a lot about statistics, and, you know, this is a big task, but it's doable. Well, what happened when the ESV CERT program started was the CMVP got flooded with people wanting to implement and certify their own versions of CPU jitter. And you can imagine 50 different vendors diving into that documentation and coming up with 50 different entropy reports, and the CMVP going through all those, trying to figure out where every single shall statement was addressed. And what it turned out was that it was taking a huge amount of time for the CMVP to analyze the same entropy source over and over. They understood how it worked, but they still had to look at every individual submission to make sure that it was fully compliant. So they came to the CMUF Entropy Working Group and they said, we need help. We need to figure out a way that people can use CPU jitter and that it can be easier for the vendors to use it and easier for the CMVP to evaluate it. So they asked the Entropy Working Group if maybe they could come up with a template that could be used by vendors that want to use CPU jitter. So Jim Ramage from Lightship said, I will be the brave soul that will start a sub-working group. They've been working for, I think, about 8 months now, and this was a big, big task. But the end result, which is pretty much in its final state, is there is now a template out there on the CMUF portal that can be used. And it's not just a template, here's this section, you need to fill it in, here's this section, you need to fill it in. 90% of it is completely populated. You just copy that into your entropy report. And then the last 10% is things that are configurable or things that, specific to your implementation. So this entropy report template, Dave Cornwell put a huge amount of work, Marcus Portnoy, developing this template. And it's for the more recent versions, the 3.4, 3.5. Joshua Hill from KeyPair wrote up a really thorough heuristic analysis, a way to analyze your source to see how much entropy it should theoretically produce. And that is out there on the portal for people to read. He used a lot of his own tools in Theseus, and I think he has links to those in his report. There are other mathematical tools that can be used too. But it's a way for the vendor to really get a handle on that theoretical estimate of how much entropy it should be produced. So this, just in the last month or so, it's pretty much, I think, been finalized. The latest development is, again, Stefan Mueller working closely with the group as this happened, especially with Josh, and they were looking at these, heuristic analysis, and Stefan made some tweaks that made it not better, but easier to certify, easier to analyze. And so there is now, as of like 2 or 3 days ago, version 3.6 has been released. I think we're going to update the template to, it won't be, I don't think it'll be much of a change to the template. The change is really to the statistical properties. But one thing I did want to make sure people understood is that that doesn't mean if you're using 3.4 or 3.5 that you need to upgrade, because this version isn't claiming to produce better entropy. It's just a little bit easier to analyze. So if you haven't started the ESV process, you may as well start with the one that's a little bit easier to analyze. If you have been using one of the older ones, you're fine. You can continue to use them. That pretty much wraps this up. If you have questions, if you just are really confused and you're not sure how to proceed, there is help out there. I would invite anybody who wants to learn more to join the Entropy Working Group. It's a great place to learn, to listen to presentations, to ask questions. The CMVP is on those calls. Usually the 90B authors are on those calls. It's a great place to learn, and to get your questions answered. And if you want to join, you can email me or Trish Wolf, my co-chair, and just tell us you want to be added to the list. That wraps that up. Does anybody have any questions?
I have a microphone for questions. Can everybody hear me?
I don't know if I need a microphone. Do I need a mic?
Because it's recorded, yeah.
Okay, that way. So I'm Rachel Parker from Intel, and I am just now kind of coming up to speed on CPU jitter. And it's a pet peeve of mine when people talk about non-physical entropy sources, because everything's physical.
Right.
Like, I don't know of any algorithm that has entropy. So I'm wondering, for the CPU jitter, how much of it comes from actual physical noise per se, and how much of it is deterministic but seemingly random? Like, if you took a CPU and chilled it down to 0 Kelvin and got rid of all thermal noise in the device, and you just ran deterministic workloads?
Yeah, you wouldn't have any entropy in that case. And some people will find out if they have a very quiet device that doesn't typically have a lot of activity in it, it's going to have lower entropy, because it's the activity on the processor that is affecting the runtime.
Okay.
And there are things in CPU jitter that can be tweaked to gather either more entropy or to change some things to try to maximize the amount of entropy. So it's not a perfect source. I'm sure there are things that it couldn't work on.
So in fairness, if you take a hardware entropy source that is physical and chill it to 0 Kelvin, you're probably out of luck there too. But
Okay.
I was just trying to understand the concept. And if you look at the 90B diagram for what an entropy source is, they have a little cloud picture, and it says analog noise source. So that probably should be changed to reflect
source,
something that
yeah.
allows CPU jitter to fit that diagram.
That's a good suggestion, actually, yeah.
We have a little bit more time. Are there any other questions?
Okay,
No?
the
Okay.
one thing I wanted to add, the Entropy Working Group has had a happy hour at ICMC for the last several years. Last year, Lightship sponsored it. This year, KeyPair offered to sponsor it. So Trisha's been handing out little cards with the location. It's not within walking distance, but I think there's a light rail that you can take, or it's a, 10-minute, 15-minute Uber ride. So I'd like to encourage people. It goes from 6 to 9 until tonight. So if you don't have any plans, please stop by and join us. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. All right, well, we're basically right about time. We had a couple people move in and out. So we'll start with the next presentation in this session. We have Richard Fant from Intel, Practical Guide to Entropy Sources. So follow up to Lisa's.
Thank you. Actually, I'm no longer with Intel, but I am available for hire or consultation, so there you go. I also shared with Lisa this morning that maybe a better venue for a happy hour for the Entropy Working Group would be next door at the casino to practice the laws of entropy. Just saying. So my name is Richard Fant, and my presentation this morning is a practical guide to entropy noise sources. This is basically, it dovetails into Lisa's presentation, but one level lower. So let me jump into it. First off, a couple of definitions. These are been used and sometimes misused in the last several years that I've been around doing this. And the delta between entropy and entropy rate. So here's the textbook definition, which I won't read, but basically entropy is everything in the system, all the randomness. Entropy rate is all that randomness divided by the number of bits that you're going to give out. Okay, that's pretty cut and dry, but what does that mean as a practical, interpretation? So I'm going to diverge for about 30 seconds here and kind of give an example. So if you have a spoonful of jelly, we'll call that entropy, right? And I choose to spread that on one piece of bread. It goes on pretty thick, right? The entropy rate is going to be the spoonful of entropy over one piece of bread, or 1 bit, if you want to translate that, which is 1, okay? If I choose to apply that same spoonful of jelly over 2 pieces of bread, it's not going to go on as thick, obviously. And so the entropy rate, not surprisingly, is going to be 0.5, 1/2. And to kind of carry this to the extreme, one more time, if I have 5 slices of bread, it probably won't surprise you what the entropy rate is, right? It's going to be 1/5 or 0.2. Now, 2 takeaways from this little simple example. Number 1, if you notice, the amount of entropy, the numerator, never changed. It's fixed in this example, right? And the other takeaway, the only way to modify the entropy rate is to determine how many pieces of bread or how many bits you're going to spread that over. In my last example, if I chose to discard 2 bits, 2 pieces of bread, right, which also, by the way, is under decimation, my entropy rate will actually go up, right? It goes to 1/3. So this distinction will be important later on in the presentation, but the main thing is human nature being what it is, sometimes people will overload the term entropy when they really mean entropy rate. All right, so anyone who's worked with 90B is familiar with this this diagram in the 90B document. It's figure 1. And basically what Lisa covered primarily was the red boundary here, right? Which is the entropy source, right? And as you can see, there are several components in there, right? You've got the conditioning elements, you've got the health test, you've got the digitization, et cetera. And what I am talking about right now is the yellow box, which is the noise source, right? This is where the actual entropy is generated or utilized or gathered, right? And to kind of highlight that, when you do a 90B entropy assessment test, the data you capture is the blue arrow on the diagram. It's the raw data from the noise source that has not been manipulated or conditioned or anything, right? And a lot of what Lisa was talking about is the green arrow, which is the output from the conditioning element. And keep in mind, this is a similar problem we have with entropy and entropy rate. Noise source and entropy source are not interchangeable terms, right? Noise source is a subset of the entropy source. All right, let's get into some examples. Lisa alluded to many of these, but I'm going to give an actual diagram, kind of what it looks like. By far, the most popular noise source out there, physical noise source, is a FRO, free running ring oscillator. And basically, it's just a little circuit made up of elements that delay it or invert it or et cetera, just kind of basically manipulate it. So suppose that current, in this example, my yellow ball is going around that ring 10 million times a second. That's 10 megahertz, right? And I want to add another FRO to it, another ring oscillator. But this time, I'm going to say the red ball is going around 50 million times a second, 50 megahertz. Okay, great. Well, what about my nth ring oscillator? Well, or I think here I call it, is it Z or nth? Okay, yeah, at Z megahertz. This one's running really, really fast. Now, I've seen designs where you can have up to 75 or more ring oscillators, but it's the same principle for all of them. And the idea is that I'm going to sample the output of those rings, right, at a regular recurring interval. In this example, I'm doing 1 kilohertz, which is incredibly slow compared to 50 megahertz or 10 megahertz. And the output of each of those rings is either going to be 0 or 1. And what I'm going to do is combine these into my black box, right, to get a single bit coming out. Now, the black box I won't go much into detail on. Basically, it could be a mathematical operation. It could be some sort of cryptographic operation. That's beyond the scope of this presentation. But the idea is the black box will combine all those inputs and start spewing out individual bits one at a time. And in this example, it's 1 bit sample size. All right, moving on. Non-physical noise source. Lisa spent a good bit of time talking about this. And basically, she hit all the main points, right? It's about timing, right? In this example, I'm using a timeline from T0 to T sub n, right? And if I have a keyboard, like for dev random, for example, and the system will measure how long a key is pressed down for, the amount of time between 2 keys, things like that. How fast does the trackball move on the mouse? These can all be, they're generated by humans, but they can be captured as a type of randomness. Well, okay, that's a pretty slow input device. But you could also use a hard drive access, right? So maybe it's measuring the number of reads versus number of writes, or it measures how long a read operation takes, or how frequently a write operation takes. All these different permutations are possible that you can measure how much time has happened between them. And the other one is the IRQ noise from the CPU, right? Basically, the CPU gets interrupted to go do tasks. How often do these tasks happen, right? How long between each task? Things like that, right? And as you can see there, all those different lines and dots on the timeline there, they're all seemingly random. And the idea is over time, the software will start collecting these deltas and feed them into this entropy pool, which is basically an abstract data type. There's not really a pool there, right? And as part of the software, it'll start combining and manipulating the data. And gradually, the pool will start to fill up with entropy, right? And eventually, when a particular threshold is met, by the software defines that, it'll allow entropy to come out of the entropy pool and be available for users, as you can see there with the bits coming out one at a time. Now, one major takeaway from here, between the the non-physical noise source and a physical noise source, non-physical is really, really, really slow compared to a physical noise source, right? And you can see why. You can't compare a keyboard strike with a ring oscillator doing 50 million loops a second. So if your customers are like that and they allow it, perfect. They don't, you can certainly use a non-physical noise source. Next one I want to talk about is the metastable latch, and the Intel version of that's called the DRNG, and D is not deterministic, D is digital random number generator. That's tripped up more than a few people, believe me. And the idea is it's a simple circuit with this yellow latch, and it's going to measure or be affected by local Gaussian noise. Now, what Gaussian noise is things like capacitors discharging or transistors changing state, things like that. And eventually, it'll be a sufficient noise to force the latch to resolve to a 1. And then after that resolution, it goes back to neutral. And then maybe more noise will happen, and it resolves to 0. And then it goes back to neutral. It goes back to neutral each time. This is why it's metastable. It wants to remain in the neutral part as much as possible. And then over time, it starts to, obviously go back and forth very quickly. Now, one neat thing about the DRNG is it's attack mitigation stuff. So suppose you have a bad guy who's going to try to manipulate your environment to either reduce your entropy, and lower entropy means you're less secure, or make your entropy so bad that the health test just reject it. Like, this is so crappy, I'm not going to let it out. I'm going to raise a flag and say your entropy source is broken. Well, here's the idea, right? The guy's trying to manipulate the temperature, and what the circuit will do is that real time it will monitor how stable the metastable latch is, and it will adjust the trigger voltage, right? Because it always wants to put that latch back in neutral. And the idea from this is that the latch should resolve primarily based on local noise, not on external stuff like temperature, maybe line voltage or whatever. And this happens real time. A good example that Rachel shared with me last night, Rachel Parker's one of the designers of this, is trying to balance a pole in your hand. You're kind of moving it around to keep it centered in the neutral position. That's very comparable to this. And as before, these ones and zeros get combined in my black box, and they come out as raw data. In this example, again, 1 bit at a time, okay? And the idea is, in general, this probably has one of the higher levels of entropy you can get in the industry, this style of metastable solution. All right. The last example I want to do is a quantum-based random number generator. Now, I'm not a physicist. I don't want to get down to the low-level details of quantum mechanics with, entanglement and things like that, but I will give you a high-level overview of it. So you have a circuit, which design looks very similar to the DRNG metastable latch, and you have a particle. In this case, I'm using an electron. Now, electrons can rotate around a arbitrary axis, clockwise in this example, right? And because the electron has a charge, when it's in motion, it's going to make a magnetic field. So I'm going to say clockwise motion means it's going to be attracted to the north pole of the diagram here, all right? But electrons can also rotate counterclockwise, which won't surprise you, generates a magnetic field in the other direction, right? So I'm going to say counterclockwise is south. And the idea is, until you measure it, an electron can be in what's called superposition. It could be clockwise or counterclockwise. You don't know, and that's where the randomness comes in. But once you measure it, let me shrink this down here. Once you measure it, it actually resolves to north or south, right? You can go a little more detail in the depth here, but I'm not going to do it for this presentation. And that's the idea. And then for the next bit, I put the system back in superposition with the new electron, right? And you can kind of see it going there back and forth depending upon the electron spin. And then as before, individual bits start to come out of the black box. So this is a quantum-based noise source. Okay, so we've talked a lot about entropy and entropy rate, but mathematically, what does that mean? Well, there is a tool written by NIST, CMVP, called the Entropy Assessment Tool, 9dB. It's available on GitHub, public domain, source code and everything. And the idea is you take the data, I'm re-showing my diagram here, from the blue arrow, right, not the green, the arrow coming from the yellow box, and you're basically going to do several things with that data you collect, this raw data, right? There is a particular format the tool does require, right? One of the most important things, you have to have a fixed length bit stream sample, right? So you can't do a 1-bit sample, then an 8-bit sample, then a 5-bit sample. You have to be consistent. So in my example here, I'm all doing 1-bit samples. The EA tool expects padding. Now, DJ Johnson, who also works with the DRNG stuff, he called this the NIST oddball format, because it's not mentally intuitive when you read the description until you kind of think about it and digest it overnight. So he calls it the knob extension. And basically what that is, so there's my raw data on the left there that I collected from the previous slides. I'm basically going to take the first bit of the raw data and put it in bit 0 of the knob format and pad the rest up to 8, in this example, with the zeros. And the next bit goes into bit 0, and you get the idea here. The only significant bit is bit 0 for a 1-bit sample size, okay? Now, after I've done that, I'm going to feed that file I just created, this raw data.knob file, into the EA tool, right, which I've compiled and put here on the screen here. And just on a side note, it's called the EA underscore. I'm using the non-IID method with a couple of different flags. I feed my knob file into that tool, and basically what this is going to do is going to run a whole bunch of different entropy assessment tools or tests against it. And you can see their most common value, Markov, T-tuple, things like that. What the software will do is take the lowest value of all those tests and say, this is my lowest value, that's my minimum entropy, which is also called min-H mathematically. And in this example, I just picked the number 0.746967 bits of entropy for 1 bit of data, right? Okay, great, I've got min entropy. What does that do for me? I don't understand how that helps me with my design or helps me convince my customers I'm a good product to buy. Well, here's how you use that. If that's my entropy rate, if I want to claim 128 bits of security, right, then I need 128 bits divided by that entropy rate. I have to generate 171 bits in order to see 128 bits of security strength, right? Pretty simple math, and one of the key takeaways here, NIST does not specify what your entropy rate has to be. They don't say you have to have this value or you're no good. They say whatever you claim, you have to be able to prove it. Mathematically, with actual data, and empirically, things like that. And, it's a distinction that's important to make. So if a vendor ever tells you or a customer says it has to have this because the government requires it, that is not a correct statement. All right, so another step of this process is the conditioning. And Lisa touched on it briefly with vetted and non-vetted conditioners. This is messing with the data at the green arrow coming out of the red box. This is data that's already been, conditioned, and I'm going to measure it. And there's a ton of equations and definitions in the 90B guide. But number one is conditioning is absolutely deterministic. There's no randomness with the conditioning. There is a list of vetted conditioning components. I think there are 6 of them, if I don't misremember, in 90B. You can use a non-vetted component, but it gets a lot more difficult because, as Lisa talked about, you have to do a lot more preparation, a lot more proofs, a lot more justification. It's a big hassle. Believe me, I've done it. So it's not a pleasant experience. And then there's a bunch of equations in the 90B document you have to satisfy, which I won't read over here. But there's some math involved, absolutely, right? And referring back to my original slide when I first started, conditioning does not increase entropy. All you can do is increase the entropy rate, right? And that's a key takeaway here because the amount of entropy is generally fixed. Okay, so let me give some actual real-world examples. I don't want to give any free advertising to any particular vendor or designer, so I'm just going to talk about the entropy or ESV number that's been assigned to them as different examples here. So one, a ring oscillator or the froze, right? So this particular one is certificate number 6. They have 32 froze and they have no conditioning, right? And this is significant because remember, conditioning is optional. You don't have to do it. And their entropy rate is 0.5, 4 bits of entropy for every 8-bit sample. Okay, that sounds pretty reasonable. Well, now this is the non-physical noise source. This is certificate number 16. They use SHA 256 in their application. Now, if you look, that's a really, I got to bend over here. That's a really small number. 0.33333333 for every 64 bits, which gives a pretty low rate there, 0.005 when you compare it to the one above it. What this means in comparison, if I want to use this to claim 128-bit security strength, I have to collect 25,000 bits to generate 128-bit strength. Now, once again, that's totally okay with NIST. If you can show that you get 0.005, that's totally okay. Now, whether your marketing guys or your customers would agree that's a good solution, that's beyond the scope of this presentation for sure. But this is how you can apply the entropy rate to see how much raw data you have to look at in order to get whatever security strength you want to claim. And the last one, the Intel version, the DRNG, certificate 57, it uses AES CBCMAC as the conditioning element. And we claim 0.6 bits of entropy. We're actually higher than that, but that's what we claim as far as NIST is concerned. And I'm going to talk about that for a quick second here. One very good strategy you can use, you may have 0.99 bits of entropy, but when you get to a certain level, it becomes more and more difficult to prove or to justify, especially dealing with some of the mathematicians at NIST, on why you can claim that amount. Well, you could claim a lower rate, which is still certainly true. If you really do a 0.99, you could say I'm 0.5. And if 0.5 is an easier number to prove or justify, it might make sense to go that way as a strategy, right? So that's sort of what Intel did here, right? Even though we're higher than this, we're actually like 0.97, to make it a timely presentation with fewer questions from NIST and fewer back and forth and comment rounds, officially we only claim 0.6. So here's the highlights from basically Lisa's presentation and my presentation. A vendor, this is kind of the roles and responsibilities, right? The vendor designed the TRNG, which is the true random number generator, right? And they need to enable it to capture raw data. That blue arrow, my diagram 1, right? There have been some vendors I've worked with who it was impossible to get raw data without jumping through a bunch of loops. And it was incredibly difficult. And frankly, if you're going to design a random number generator, to include this as a design for test, it's a much better strategy to actually prove it later on. And as I mentioned before, FIPS does not specify the amount you need. You just have to justify whatever you claim, right? And this ties with the marketing sales force, right? If what you can claim and prove, is that good enough for what your customers want? Now, the vendors still have to work with a third-party CST lab. And last time I checked, I think there are 20 or 21 of them in the world right now. So you probably already have a relationship with the CST lab. If you don't, you will have to get one. And basically, the idea is the CST lab acts as the go-between between the vendor and NIST, or the CMVP. Think of it like you're dealing with the IRS through a CPA, right? The CPA does all the paperwork for you, answers all the questions from the government, and basically, ask you questions, why do you claim this, why do you claim that? And then ultimately, the government and the CPA come into agreement. In this example, it's the same thing. The government and the third-party CST lab come to agreement on what it should be. They also write a public use document. Now, this one can be written by the vendor, or it could be written by the CST lab, depends on what your contract says. Obviously, you have to generate raw data, and this must be done on actual production parts, right? It cannot be done in simulation. It must be at least for a physical noise source, you have to use an actual production part to do it and capture it. And there's two different flavors of it. One is the continuous raw data, and the other one is the raw data with restarts. You got to collect 1 million bits of continuous data. You have to collect 1,024 bits with 1,024 restarts, which makes up 1 million bits. The idea being that your entropy should not be lower when you first power on the system versus a day later or whatever. So that's why it's important to have both types of data collected. As I mentioned, the third-party lab then works with the CMVP. They write the entropy assessment report. This is also an overloaded term, right? A lot of vendors say they write the EAR. They really don't. The third-party lab writes the EAR to the government. And generally, the EAR is a proprietary document owned by the third-party lab. And generally, the only people who ever see it is the third-party lab and the government. You might have different, your mileage may vary if you have different arrangements with your lab, but in general, this is how the labs make a lot of their money. They also review or possibly even write the public use document, the PUD. This is basically like a 10 or 12 page short quick start user's guide for what you're claiming and how you claim it, what's your noise source, et cetera, and it's a standard template, because once again, the government does not want to read 50 different design templates for the same type of application. They want a common theme, common template to help speed up the process. And then basically the third-party lab submits all the stuff to the government and answers their questions as your go-between. And eventually you get an ESV certificate. And that's basically my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Perfect.
Hi, great presentation. Roy Steffen from Quantinium. I wanted to pull the thread a little bit on when you're talking about going from a 0.97 min entropy down to 0.6, I think you said, because you viewed it as more reliable or easier to defend. In 2018, NIST wrote a paper about how statistical analytics are impossible to guarantee randomness, and to have true randomness, you have to use a quantum computer with a Bell test, relying more on the Bell test for provability than the statistical analytics that have been traditionally used with legacy RNGs like you're talking about here, even with the QRNGs as you described it. I wondered if there was anything more you could say about sort of statistical analytics and why you made that 0.97 to 0.6 adjustment.
The simple answer is I can't, NDA, but yeah.
Fair enough. Thank you for your talk.
Sure. But on a side note, clearly quantum stuff is coming, right? We've already got a deadline, 2030, we've got to be switching over. Nothing for random numbers yet, but I mean, that's the wave of the future. So quantum is good.
Do we have any more questions? So I'm going to ask one. So what is your, I know there have been other talks about this, but I'm going to say, what is your experience with the difference between having to go with the ESVs now versus not ESVs?
Okay, so I've actually done both. I've done the ENT and the ESV. From the documentation point of view, it's actually very similar, right? The only real challenge is the process on how you submit it. And the PUD is a new introduction for the ESV, the public use document. But really, there's not much difference as far as from the bottom up, right? And that's one reason why they had that transition program to go from an ENT to ESV is fairly painless to do it. So,
does anybody else have any other questions? All right, well, I think we have a couple minutes before our last presentation then, so thank you.
All right, thank you.
Hello, we'll get started with the last of our presentations for this session. So we have, it's okay. We have Johannes Mittmann from BSI in Germany. He will be making the entire presentation today on post-processing algorithms and conditioning functions for entropy sources. So take it away.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. Yeah, so my name is Johannes Mittmann. I work at BSI, and this presentation has been prepared together with John Kelsey from NIST, and the talk is about post-processing algorithms and conditioning functions for entropy sources. So here's a schematic diagram of an entropy source. We've seen a similar picture in Richard's talk. And an entropy source consists of three main components: the noise source, here including digitization, then the health tests, and a third component, which is optional, is a post-processing algorithm or conditioning function. And John and I gave talks about noise sources and health tests at the previous two ICMCs, so this is kind of part 3 of our trilogy. So what is a post-processing algorithm? It's an algorithm that takes as input the raw data, or in AIS 2031 terminology, the raw random numbers. And those can be bits or bit strings, but they could also be more naturally represented, for example, by natural numbers or any discrete set. And the sequence of raw random numbers is then processed by the post-processing algorithms, and its output is either called output data or internal random numbers, and those are usually then either bits or bit vectors. And the terminology can differ among standards or in the literature, but here we just use post-processing and conditioning interchangeably. And for more specific situations, there are also terms like unbiasing or entropy extractors. So what are the goals of post-processing? First of all, let's say you have raw random numbers that aren't already represented as bits or bit vectors, then this post-processing algorithms could transform them into bits. Other goals are to enhance statistical properties of the raw random numbers, for example, to reduce bias or dependencies, or more generally, to achieve statistical inconspicuousness of the output data. But the main goal, I would say, is to increase the entropy per data bit. And I think Richard in his previous talk explained this quite well. I mean, a deterministic algorithm cannot increase the total amount of entropy, but if it uses data compression, so if the output length is smaller than the input size, then in this case, the entropy per data bit can be increased, and this process is also called entropy extraction. So the remainder of this talk is organized as follows. First of all, I will look at some properties of post-processing algorithm and give some simple examples. And afterwards, I will look into specifics how RNG standards deal with post-processing algorithms. So let's get started. So first of all, post-processing algorithms can be divided into being algorithmic or cryptographic, and we will look at this more closely in the next slide. Then furthermore, post-processing algorithms can just be simple functions, or they could have memories, or memory. So in the first case, they are called stateless in this talk, and if they keep memory between different invocations, then we call them stateful. Usually, post-processing algorithms are deterministic. Sometimes in the literature also seeded post-processing algorithms are used, or sometimes they take a key. But in this talk, we will just consider deterministic post-processing algorithms. And also in case you have like a seed that remains fixed over a longer period of time, you can also more or less call this a deterministic algorithm. Then final property of post-processing algorithm is its compression rate. So this is defined as the input bit length divided by the output bit length. And for some post-processing algorithms, this ratio is fixed, but it can also be variable. So yeah, in this case, you would define the compression rate as the average input length divided by the output length, for example. What we call algorithmic post-processing are algorithms that use simple operations, for example, just XORing bits or F2 linear maps and so on. And in order to analyze the effects of those simple kind of algorithms, we need to have some knowledge about the input distribution. So preferably, we would have a stochastic model for the raw random numbers. And in this case, then we can use this model to rigorously or mathematically compute an entropy lower bound for the output. However, if the assumptions on this input distribution would be wrong, then there might be bad interactions with the noise source, and entropy could even be cancelled out completely, for example. Cryptographic post-processing, on the other hand, uses cryptographic operations or primitives, such as hash functions, max, RBGs, and so on. And to analyze those, one often models those cryptographic functions as random mappings, if this is appropriate. And in this case, or for this kind of analysis, we don't need to know the input distribution, but it's enough to know the entropy of the input. And this kind of post-processing is then also more robust concerning properties of the input distribution. So here's a first example of, or maybe one of the simplest examples for algorithmic post-processing. So just XORing M non-overlapping bits. So in this case, we assume that we have given random bits that can be considered as realization of IID random variables. So this means independent and identically distributed. And we have one parameter, which is the probability of having a 1 bit. And we denote this by P. Then the effect of the post-processing is just the random variable by J, which consists of the XOR of M bits. And in this simple case, we can derive a closed formula for the distribution of the output. And we see in the formula that if the number of bits we XOR gets larger, then this tends to the uniform distribution, so unless the input sequence was constant. And from this, we also get a closed formula for the min entropy of the output bits. The compression rate in this case is M, because we take M input bits and produce 1 output bit. And on the bottom of the slides, there's a numerical example. So if the probability of a 1 bit, for example, is 0.75, this corresponds to a min entropy of 0.415 of the input. Then we would need to XOR 8 bits in order to arrive at a min entropy greater than 0.99. Another well-known example of an algorithmic post-processing is von Neumann unbiasing. In this case, the input bit sequence is, you consider pairs of the input bits, and if you have a pair 0, 1 or 1, 0, then you map them to 0 and 1. And if you have pairs 0, 0 and 1, 1, you discard those bits. For example, on the bottom of the slides, 0, 1 gets 0, then 1, 1 gets discarded, 1, 0 becomes 1, 0, 1 becomes 0, and 0, 0 is discarded again. So to analyze this kind of post-processing, we again assume that the raw bits are realizations of IID random variables with a parameter p, and then we just rewrite the rule for Neumann unbiasing we just saw in terms of random variables. And if we then look at the probability of the non-discarded bits, so those that yield output 0 or 1, we have a perfect uniform distribution unless, no matter what the parameter p was. But of course, this only holds in a strict sense if we have the exact assumptions on the input distribution. And uniformly distributed bit means min entropy 1. On the other hand, in this case, the compression rate is not fixed, and the average compression rate depends on the parameter p. So this is given by p inverse times 1 minus p inverse. And even if the input sequence is already perfectly uniform, so this corresponds to p being 0.5, then the compression rate would be 4 on average. So 4 input bits are needed to generate 1 output bit. And if p is 0.75, like in the previous example, then the average compression rate is 5.33. So this is less than 8 in the previous example, but it's also just a value on average. So it could be more than 8 bits could be required in the worst case. So finally, we look at an example of a cryptographic post-processing algorithm. Again, one of the simplest conceivable examples, namely just applying a cryptographic hash function. So in this case, we assume that the raw random numbers are bit vectors of length n in, and we just assume that they have a min entropy of h in. And then in this example, I took the SHA-256 hash function, which has an output size n out of 256 bits. And the post-processing just consists of hashing some bits of length n in non-overlapping bit vectors. So here's again a numerical example, and I chose a similar bit entropy rate, so entropy per bit, as in the previous example. Samples like 0.418. So for example, we could have strings of 650 bits, which contain 272 bits of min entropy. And in this case, if you're doing analysis using modeling this hash function at the random mapping, then under this assumption, you can derive a min entropy estimate per bit of 0.99. And in this case, the compression rate was 2.54. So this is the highest bit rate of the 3 examples I presented. But on the other hand, computing a cryptographic hash function takes more area if it's implemented in hardware, and also energy and computation time. But otherwise, as the bit rate is concerned, it is the most efficient. So there are several trade-offs in all of those examples. So more detailed analysis, how you can derive those min entropy estimates, are contained in the NIST document IR 8427 and in the new AIS 2031. And as a rule of thumb, With some caveats, you could say that if you want to achieve a min entropy per bit of approximately 1 minus 2 to the minus t, so entropy defect of 2 to the minus t, then the entropy you need is the output size of your post-processing algorithm plus 2t bits. Okay, so now let's look into the RNG standards. So in the SP890 series, we have entropy sources, which are defined in part 90b. And their post-processing is called conditioning functions. And as we also already heard in the previous talk, they can be vetted or non-vetted. We will also look at this property again on the next slide. And in the upcoming part 90c, we have RBG constructions. And for example, even though this isn't the terminology NIST uses, but the RBG3 construction, for example, could be considered stateful cryptographic post-processing. Namely, you have an approved DRBG. I mean, this is not considered part of the entropy source, but yeah, it can fulfill a similar purpose. In AIS 2031, we have functionality classes. So for example, PTG2, which roughly corresponds to a physical entropy source. There you also have an optional post-processing, and it can be algorithmic or cryptographic. And for functionality classes PTG3 and NTG1, so those are functionality classes for physical and non-physical hybrid RNGs. And those are similar to RBG constructions by NIST. In this case, a stateful cryptographic post-processing algorithm is required. So let's look at the difference of vetted and non-vetted conditioning functions again. So vetted conditioning functions, as we heard before, is a fixed list of, let's say, pre-approved cryptographic post-processing algorithms. They are all stateless. Some of them are keyed, some are unkeyed. And yeah, so John told me that they are intended as a safe harbor, so they can easily be used and there are no known problems. The NIST 90b provides a formula based on the input and output bit length, on the input entropy and the narrowest internal width. So the formula was shortly shown on Richard's slides. I don't show them here, yeah, but they can be used. And NIST also plans to add further algorithms to the list of vetted conditioning functions over time. So non-vetted conditioning functions, on the other hand, can be algorithmic or cryptographic. For example, it could be a non-approved cryptographic hash function, but in this case, you have to give some justification why this post-processing algorithm doesn't interact badly with your noise source. And there's also a similar formula to create or to compute an entropy lower bound, but this also takes into account an entropy estimate on the conditioned data. But this serves more like a sanity check. And another requirement is that for non-vetted conditioning functions, the output may not be truncated. So I guess the reason is that in case the entropy isn't evenly distributed over the output bits, that you don't cut off some entropy. So finally, there's the notion of full entropy. So full entropy means that you have more than 1 minus 2 to the minus 32 bits of min entropy per data bit. So this is a term of the 890 series. And in SP 890, if you use vetted conditioning functions and your entropy is as large as the output size of the conditioning functions plus 64 or larger, then you can claim full entropy of the output. This also fits together with this rule of thumb I have shown on the previous slide. If you're using non-vetted conditioning functions, then claim of full entropy is not allowed. And finally, in the RBG3 construction, there you have full entropy by design because you have the requirement to perform reseeding with a sufficient amount of min entropy. In AIS 2031, functionality class PTG2, so physical entropy sources. In this case, you can't claim full entropy, so this is forbidden by the standard. There is a fixed min entropy lower bound of 0.98. But for functionality class PTG3 and NTG1, those have a cryptographic state for cryptographic post-processing. You can claim full entropy if you provide the corresponding evidence. Okay, so let me wrap up. Here are the key takeaways of this talk. So post-processing algorithms aim to increase the entropy per data bit. There are different trade-offs possible between efficiency, entropy rate, and robustness. Algorithmic post-processing requires knowledge of the input distribution. For cryptographic post-processing, you just need to know the entropy of the input. And finally, if you're using vetted conditioning functions or the RBG3 construction in SP 890 or functionality classes PTG3 and NTG1 in AS 2031, then you can make a claim of full entropy. So this concludes my talk, and now I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Do we have questions? Wow. I hate to say it, but I don't think that I can ask an intelligent question on this. So if there are no questions, then I think, good. Someone with a good intelligent question.
Well, we'll determine if it's intelligent or not. When comparing the NIST to the AIS approaches, do you have the same vetted conditioners, or does the AIS process have a different list of vetted conditioners that they've been through?
Yeah, so AIS 2031 is technologically neutral, let's say, and it doesn't have like BSI approved mechanisms. So in principle, any post-processing algorithm can be used as long as it satisfies a predetermined set of requirements.
Okay.
And but of course, the AIS 2031 document has many examples. So if you use one of the examples, then you might have an easier time than providing proofs for yourself, but in principle, you can do everything that is appropriate.
That makes sense. You did have a slide in there that was talking about how if on the NIST side, I'm a little more familiar with the NIST side, I apologize, but on the NIST side, if you use a non-vetted conditioner, then you can't reach full entropy. And on the AIS side, there was 2 levels, one that did have full entropy and one that did not have full entropy. So do you have a different condition besides a vetted conditioner? I shouldn't use the word condition, it's ceasing to have any meaning now. But so what's the difference in the AIS one?
One of the reasons is, so first of all, the class PTG2, which doesn't allow full entropy claims, it historically often just has algorithmic post-processing, but it also should be said that the output of those classes shouldn't be used directly for generating keys. This is only used for seeding deterministic RNGs or as part of hybrid RNG constructions like PTG3. And full entropy claims are only allowed for PTG3 because there you have stateful cryptographic post-processing. And the reason is that when you model the post-processing algorithm as a random mapping, then this model assumption is a bit more realistic in case you have a stateful algorithm, because a fixed hash function, it behaves randomly, but at the end of the day it's still a fixed function. And if there is some internal state that changes all the time, then the map from the input to the output data also changes all the time. So this does fit a little bit more to this random mapping assumptions. And I think this is one of the motivations why those full entropy claims are just allowed for PTG3 and NTG1, which have this kind of requirement on the post-processing.
That's very helpful. Thank you for your talk.
Welcome.
Are there any other questions?
Thanks, Johannes. It's good to see that NIST and BIS are doing some work together. Could you just comment quickly on future plans for collaboration between NIST and BIS in terms of activities, or maybe even some standards documents? Thanks.
Well, I don't want to spoil it too much because we have a panel later this day. But NIST and BSI, we've been working together for several years now, and this week a joint document was published, and also a new version of AIS 2031. But maybe I already said enough, so please go to the panel.
Okay. Any last questions? All right. Then I want to thank Johannes again for a great presentation. And we are now on our next 30, or in this case, 32-minute break.